On my way over to the studio to record this second part of the first week's lecture, I managed to catch a glimpse of today's Senate hearing where Dr. Anthony Fauci was presenting evidence.
And as much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you're the end all. I don't think you're the one person that gets to make a decision. We can listen to your advice, but there are people on the other side saying there's not going to be a surge and that we can safely open the economy, and the facts will bear this out. But if we keep kids out of school for another year, what's going to happen is the poor and underprivileged kids who don't have a parent that's able to teach them at home are not going to learn for a full year. And I think we ought to look at the Swedish model, and we ought to look at letting our kids get back to school. I think it's a huge mistake if we don't open the schools in the fall. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond to that even though there are only 32 seconds left?
Yes, and you might make it clear whether or not you suggested that we shouldn't go back to school in the fall.
Well, first of all, Senator Paul, thank you for your comments. I have never made myself out to be the end-all and only voice in this. I'm a scientist, a physician, and a public health official. I give advice according to the best scientific evidence. There are a number of other people who come into that and give advice that are more related to the things that you spoke about the need to get the country back open again and economically.
And Fauci was being asked by one of the senators, maybe Rand Paul or someone. Fauci was being asked about the relative importance of weighing medical advice about the coronavirus against economic advice. And Fauci said something interesting in answer. Fauci simply said, I am a doctor. I am a scientist. I can provide you only with a scientific point of view. I'm not an economist. I can't tell you about the economic point of view. And I was thinking about that because it's an interesting and revealing answer. And it speaks to a central feature of this semester's class. We're going to be looking at international relations, at least in part, from an ethical point of view. We're not looking at international relations from an economic point of view. We're not always going to be looking at international relations from a geopolitical or security point of view. We're going to be focusing on an ethical point of view. But that really begs the question, how much should we weigh the ethical perspective against the legal perspective, against the economic perspective, or against any other perspective? That's a difficult question. But in order to make any headway with that question, we first need to know what the ethical point of view, the ethical perspective is. Fauci knew what the scientific point of view was with respect to coronavirus. Economists know what the economic point of view is with respect to coronavirus. What's the ethical point of view? Or what's the political point of view? How much should you weigh ethical perspectives, political perspectives, legal perspectives, scientific perspectives? Okay, now let me say something more specific about the ethical point of view. I take my lead here from the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume made the observation that human beings approve and disapprove of actions. They praise and they blame. And he made the further point that ethical approval or disapproval involves approving or disapproving from a general or impartial perspective. It's very different from approving or disapproving an action as it bears on my interests or my friend's interests or me and my mate's interests or my country person's interests. From an ethical perspective, we approve or disapprove of actions or institutions from an impartial perspective. That's point number one. Point number two, typically when we ethically approve or disapprove, we do so in terms of general rules, general principles. Think, for example, of ethical principles like do not rob, do not steal, do not lie, keep your promises. These are all general rules. So we've got two distinctive features of an ethical perspective. One, that it's impartial. We view things from the perspective of an impartial spectator. And secondly, we approve or disapprove with respect to general principles, general rules. Now note that nothing has been said so far about the content of these general principles, general rules. Hume thought that all societies everywhere approve and disapprove in much the same way because of our common human psychology. I think that's a debatable point. I think a less debatable point is the following, and this is the third thing I want to say about the ethical point of view. When we approve or disapprove from an ethical perspective, the content of those approvals or disapprovals will be linked to human flourishing. It will be linked to some conception of how our lives go better, what we need by way of rules or practices or norms that make human society function better, make our lives as members of human society go well. I think that's an essential component of the ethical point of view. And we disagree amongst ourselves about the features of an individual life and a society that are necessary to make our lives go better. But that's that's where the content comes from in an ethical point of view. Now, one can adopt the position of an ethical skeptic. An ethical skeptic refuses to look at the world from an impartial point of view. An ethical skeptic says, I don't want to play that game. For me, I approve or disapprove solely on the basis of how it affects my self-interests, how it affects my friends' interests. I don't want to play any of this impartial game. And that's the position of the ethical skeptic. Now, some moral philosophers, Thomas Hobbes is one of these people, argue that when one confronts a true ethical skeptic, one confronts a sociopath. And a sociopath has no place in a civilized society. And for Hobbes, we should throw out sociopaths from our society. We should even be prepared to kill them, he argues. I think that an ethical skeptic is a weird position, and I don't think there are many ethical skeptics in the world. Now, but when it comes to international relations, ethical skepticism is a very common position, albeit it's a particular type of ethical skepticism. And we give this form of ethical skepticism in international relations a name, namely realism. Now, realists don't reject morality in general. They simply say that when it comes to the relations between states, ethical skepticism is the only appropriate position. You can't expect impartiality in a world as insecure, a world so lacking in basic security as the world we find amongst states in the international system. So realism is a form of ethical skepticism limited to the international world. Now, critics of realism, I count myself as one of them, don't think that the international world is as insecure, unstable, and so inappropriate for impartial judgments. And I will press this point with some vigour in some of my later lectures. Thank you.